Hello, everyone. You are watching an exclusive interview series by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities, and this is your host, Faiqa Lakho, Deputy Convener at South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. Today, our guest is Professor Dean Accardi from USA. Professor Dean Accardi is an historian of gender, religion, and politics in South Asia and the Islamic world. He is interested in secularism and religious conflict, as well as the connections between religious and political practices, institutions, and discourses in early modern and modern worlds. His research focuses on the gendered ascetic practices of saints revered by both Hindus and Muslims, and their use to establish and articulate religious and political power. His research and teaching highlight how historical and religious narratives constantly reconstruct and deploy the past to serve particular socio-political agendas. His research and teaching also re-examine notions of mutually exclusive religions, hybridity, and syncretism, aiming to reconceptualize relationships between religious and other social and cultural phenomena with particular attention to race, class, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. He is currently working as an assistant professor of history at Connecticut College, USA. Thank you, Professor Dean, for giving us your valuable time.
Thank you, Faiqa, and thank you, Sarim, for inviting me to speak with you today.
You're welcome. So moving towards our first question, Professor Dean, just tell us about yourself, from where you belong, and how did you end up being a historian? How and why did you develop an interest in South Asian history particularly? What was the inspiration behind that?
Thank you, and thank you for this question. So I was born in the United States in the Chicago area, and as a teenager, I developed an interest in religion more generally. But as a college student, I developed an interest more focused in South Asia, both Hinduism and Islam in equal measure. I completed my bachelor's degree in religious studies at Loyola University, as well as a master's degree in religion from Columbia University. However, before completing my master's degree, I felt I needed more depth in contextualization of my understanding of religion. So I shifted my pursuits to a PhD in South Asian cultures and languages at the University of Texas at Austin, with a heavy focus on history. Part of the reason for this is that too often the study of religion focuses almost exclusively on beliefs, cosmologies, theology, and other kind of abstract concepts, as if religion exists without people. But what is clear to most of us in everyday life is that religion as it exists in the world is steeped in social, political, economic, and cultural contexts. And to ignore these contexts is to misapprehend how much religion and, frankly, much of the world works within contexts. History, then, for me, is a study of those contexts over time and how the intersections of these different contexts and actions of individuals and groups therein change over time and have shaped what we see now and may experience in the future. Perhaps some historians might disagree with me, but I feel the study of history is always connected to the present, to hit us here and now, and to see how power has come to constellate around us as it does in the present, so that we can go forth and engage the world and hopefully change things for the better.
So thank you so much for your answer, Professor Dean. Moving towards our next question. As you are a professor of history and have extensive knowledge of the early modern and modern world with regard to religious and political practices, have you explored the roots of the current state of South Asian minorities, for instance, Muslims, Christians, and Dalits, in history?
Yes, and while I'm by no means an expert on all minority groups across time and locations, I doubt most anyone could be, but I will state two general observations that I have come to gather. First, that there's nothing inherent to any particular race, religion, gender, caste, or other identity that naturally predetermines ability. So despite volumes of writings in this regard in the 19th and 20th centuries that strive to justify privilege or oppression on the basis of inherent superiority or suitability, this is patently false. Brahmins are not inherently suited to intellectual work, nor are Islam or Muslims more inherently compatible or incompatible with secularism, and so on. Rather, and this is my second observation, those with wealth and power often tend to do whatever it takes to further secure and accumulate wealth and power. So sometimes the demographic identities of those with wealth and power belong to a group with, technically speaking, minority status, such as white European Christians being afforded undue privilege, wealth, and power during British, French, and Portuguese colonial rule. Yet even during those times, there were always other South Asian elites who were willing to collaborate with such hegemonic colonial powers to increase their own wealth, power, and position. But I digress. While indeed hegemony of minorities have occurred, more often than not, and increasingly so today more than ever in the past, is the tyranny of the majority. However, majoritarianism is not simply those belonging to a demographic majority wielding more power. Rather, it is often a smaller group of wealthy, powerful members of the majority community doing what they can to mobilize the masses in the majority community to oppress minority communities to benefit themselves. So relatively poor and disenfranchised members of the majority community are at times willing to be mobilized in these ways because they perceive themselves as aligned with those with power and wealth in the majority community and think that they might ascend the socioeconomic ladder by fostering that connection. And in some cases, this may indeed be true. Being part of a majoritarian community might result in better employment, etc. But almost always the benefits gained by the most wealthy and powerful in the majority group far outweighs whatever minor gains the rest of the majority community might receive through such alignment. Perhaps this doesn't matter to some because it's a matter of survival to align themselves in such a way. But in any case, it is the most disadvantaged members of minority communities that often face the worst in such majoritarian dynamics, which unfortunately seems to dominate much of South Asia today.
Yes, definitely. You are very right, Professor Dean. So my next question is regarding socio-political agendas. That do you believe that socio-political agendas have altered the actual histories of majorities in order to achieve personal gains and power over minorities?
Yes, absolutely. While it's kind of a bit of a truism that history is written by the victors, it's remarkable to see how openly this is being done in South Asia today. The openly changing textbooks, rewriting history in order to suit the those who are in power and erase narratives that are no longer convenient for those in power. Famed political scientist Benedict Anderson demonstrates in his book Imagine Communities that the nation state, which dominates the political order after World War II, that history, as well as museums, maps, censuses, and other institutions are intentionally recrafted and deployed by states in order to inculcate national identities within their populations. And since many understand nation as consisting of one people with a shared history, language, and culture coming from the same bounded territory and ruled over by a government that represents that one people, then inevitably the history of that nation will privilege narrations of the past that center on and justify the dominance of that one group of people. But this is rarely a natural condition. Rather, many people must be made to believe that they belong to a certain national identity, even if they previously did not consider themselves belonging to the same group as others being lumped into that national identity. So this kind of concomitant inculcation of a national identity in the general populace is also connected to delineating who does not belong. So the history of minority groups are narrated in ways that they are made to be foreigners or otherwise not belonging, such that they implicitly or explicitly are told to either leave or passively submit to be a second-class citizen, and subject to the will of the dominance of the majority community identified with this nation concept. So, for example, in India, Christians and Muslims are made to decide whether they are foreigners and thus should be grateful guests or go back to where they come from, or converts, in which case they need to convert back to their native religion of Hinduism. but it is similar to how ethnic minorities like Biharis are treated in Bangladesh or Nepalis in Bhutan. And it doesn't matter how many generations a certain person's ancestors have lived in a particular place. Under majoritarian nationalism, individuals from a minority community, through these historical narratives of belonging, are identified as belonging elsewhere and are thus told to submit or to leave.
Yeah, thank you for sharing these insights, Professor. Now, my next question is also related to the history and your domain, that how has history been exploited to target a particular group of minorities or particular group of people based on their religious inclination in South Asia?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, as I mentioned, history is often crafted and deployed in order to make minority communities appear to not belong, which often results in their losing basic rights afforded to other citizens. But religious identity is kind of particularly insidious in this regard, for it's often implied that religious affiliation is a matter of choice. And thus, to belong to the majority community would say, you just need to merely convert to the majority religion, and then you would be fine. Why are you refusing to do so? And so this refusing is then taken as proof of a recalcitrant rejection of the nation, making them anti-nationals or blasphemers, and thus subject to suspicion and marginalization, or even imprisonment, violence, or even death. But as we should all know, hopefully, religion is rarely simply a matter of choice. Instead, more often, religion functions kind of like ethnicity, something that you were born into and steeped in socially throughout one's life, so that converting would mean abandoning one's family, community, socioeconomic support networks, and so on. And this is particularly acute amongst the poor and disenfranchised, as a wealthy person can often choose to change one's religion with very little consequences, since they have ample power, wealth, and privilege from other sources, such that changing one's religion doesn't lead to a disaster in their lives. But for the poor and disenfranchised, the ultimatum to convert or leave is a command to submission, for they literally cannot afford to do so. Because they would lose what sources of connection and social networks and support networks that they currently have. So those that do convert, even those who do take the ultimatum, are then viewed with suspicion by the majority community, as either simply putting on a facade, so they're secretly still practicing their previous religion but are saying that they are not, or they're seen with suspicion because they're seen as being too willing to be disloyal, ironically. And added on top of that their previous religious community might even shun them for abandoning their family's religion. So because religion is talked about as if it were simply a personal choice, those born into minority religious communities are often in a double bind, facing oppression no matter what they do.
Yes, true. These are the dark realities of today. So, well, moving forward, tell us something about your research. On which areas of history have you mainly focused, and how it has transformed your historical perspectives?
Thank you. Yeah. So as you mentioned in the introduction, my research focuses on the intersections of religion, gender, and politics in South Asia, with a particular focus on Kashmir. So my current book project is the tentative title for the book is An Ascetic Body Politic, examines how religious institutions during the 16th century Kashmiri Sultanate came to be centered around ascetic saints, which in turn served to develop a sophisticated early modern state in Kashmir, even before the advent of Mughal rule over the region. And the Mughals are often celebrated, especially Akbar is celebrated as the one who really instituted a whole imperial bureaucracy with a complex state and so on and so forth. And my argument is that this, in fact, preceded the Mughals coming to Kashmir. But my research into this time period is not just happenstance or just interest in this area. It's in fact because this time period, the 16th century, or really the 14th through the 16th century, and the rule of the Kashmiri Sultanate is considered by many Kashmiris as the last time that Kashmiris ruled over themselves before many other empires took over. And so many of the important figures and cultural practices developed during this time are central to Kashmiri heritage and identity. So many of the same religious figures that serve political ends in that past that I'm examining continue to be deployed for political assertions regarding Kashmiri belonging today, albeit in different ways and towards different ends. So my historical research aims to demonstrate how, on the one hand, current religious practices and political identities end up being projected into the past, and on the other hand, how ideas about saints and other figures from the past persist and sometimes interrupt contemporary agendas of the present.
Okay, that's quite very interesting, and looking forward to read your work in near future.
Thank you.
So moving towards another question, I want to ask that how have colonial institutions, laws, and historiography shaped the perceptions of our respective minorities, Muslims, Christians, and Dalits? From time to time, we have seen insurgencies break out in South Asian countries. What do you think are the main reasons behind that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is a very important question. And colonial institutions had major impacts on religious and other minorities that we continue to see to this day. For example, as brilliantly demonstrated in Lata Mani's Contentious Traditions, it was British colonial rulers who understood Hindus and Muslims as two monolithic and mutually exclusive communities. And that prior to the British, there were many groups who are now considered Hindu who did not see themselves as belonging to one overarching Hindu community. And furthermore, many people's religious lives involved engaging in ideas, beliefs, and practices that either crossed religious boundaries or, like many people then and now of both Hindu and Muslim communities, that not everyone necessarily engaged in all of the things considered essential components of Hinduism or Islam writ large, as we often talk about them today. You know, people often pick and choose, oh, I do these parts of my religious practices, but those things, I'm not going to bother with them and whatnot. So with the British defining these categories, it ends up that many people were made to affiliate themselves either as one or the other and defined in the particular ways that the British defined them. Furthermore, the British East India Company, which ruled from 1757 to 1857, you know, under the auspices of the final Mughal rulers, governed over colonial Bengal, but didn't want to extend English common law to their colonial subjects. So they sought to kind of rule Indians according to their own laws. So, but at the same time, they didn't trust native officials to really do that in a kind of honest and fair way because they were always suspicious of other people. So they decided to draft their own canons of Hindu law and Muslim law. So this forced people, as I said, to identify as Hindus and Muslims as their primary identity through which they would be ruled because laws were coded that by religion. So that became the prime identity by which one would be identified and, you know, laws would be drafted. But it also meant that Hindu and Muslim traditions that the British deemed authoritative became the laws enforced upon everyone. So much so that the diversity of Hindu and Muslim traditions, or the rigorous debates and disagreements amongst Hindu and Muslim scholars about what is the correct way to be a good Muslim or to be a good Hindu, that's all thrown out the window and there's one codified law for each group. And much of what was codified by the British back then, in fact, continues to serve as the basis of personal law across much of South Asia today, whether or not those things were even true for most Hindus or Muslims previously. So I mentioned this, and this is just one example, but similar things, similar ways in which communities were shaped through legal apparatuses under the British happened through other colonial mechanisms as well, such as the census, dividing and determining people's position in society according to caste, language, ethnicity, and so on. And this would be repeated it should be repeated that many Indians or colonial Indians themselves under British India took up this project themselves. Like I said, collaborated, worked along with these, and provided information saying, "Oh, this is the more proper way to divide society," and therefore those people were willing to work with the British in order to often position their group as higher in these schemes of hierarchies and exploit those with lower social status for their own benefit and wealth. So I bring all this together to say, therefore, that insurgencies more often than not have arisen amongst groups who were oppressed under British rule, who were promised equal freedom, rights, privileges, access to education and economic justice under the new independent nation states after the collapse of the British Empire, but found themselves often in the same conditions under post-colonial regimes, because often it was those who collaborated with the British who ended up in positions of power in the post-colonial states. So often the same apparatuses that were there before continued into the new states. And Aisha Jalal does a great job showing how this kind of momentum functions, that the post-colonial states often adopt the same types of power in post-colonial states. So those groups who were oppressed under the British, now oppressed under the new nation states, are often left with two options. And in fact, more often than not, different individuals within those groups pursue them simultaneously. So it's either publicly protest in order to receive the rights and privileges they were promised, or fight for independence so they can form their own nation states that will actually represent and protect them and provide for them, rather than continuing to be exploited and oppressed. So like I mentioned before, this kind of double bind, often minority communities, that insurgency is one of the few options left, and that it's not that they do that instead of public protest, but often both of those things are happening, and unfortunately, more often than not, just leads to increased crackdown on those populations rather than granting them the rights and protections they should be receiving under even according to the laws that already exist on the books.
Yes, and you're very much right. And thank you so much for sharing that particular insight of colonial rule with our audience. So moving forward, my next question is, what are your thoughts on the gradual rise of religious radicalism and genocide of Muslims in South Asia? What are the causes and reasons behind the hate for minorities, including Christians, Muslims, and Dalits?
Thank you. And one thing I'll just say is that I think it's important to differentiate between India and South Asia, even though we know India in many ways is a kind of the most powerful in international circles in South Asia. South Asia is much more than India. And so, violence against Muslims for being Muslims is indeed happening in India, but also Nepal and Sri Lanka, but not Bangladesh and Pakistan. That is not to say that violence and oppression of minorities are not happening in Bangladesh and Pakistan, but rather that Muslims are the majority communities there. And so Muslims that face violence in those countries often face that violence due to other reasons, such as their ethnic identity or caste or being Shia or promoting another version of Islam that does not align with those promulgated by those in power. Furthermore, kind of Christians and Hindus have faced violence and oppression in Bangladesh and Pakistan as well. Given this kind of, it's important to point out, and once again, Aisha Jalal points out that we talk about South Asia and oftentimes before that British India as kind of analyze it as one coherent identity, but then in 1947, we talk about them as if they're like totally foreign and unrelated countries. But we see that similar dynamics arise in similar times across South Asia. So while there are some slight differences in the timelines in different countries in South Asia, the recent rise of religious violence seems to have really accelerated from the late 1970s through the early 90s. And in part, I believe this is the result of governments and business elites intentionally cracking down on economically based political movements, leaving oppressed and disadvantaged groups needing other axes along which to advocate for themselves. So certain powerful groups took religion as a means by which to gain the support of oppressed masses and to turn them against industrial and agricultural elites and promised to those masses that they would reclaim the wealth of those elites and redistribute it to the masses more equitably in the name of religion. And when those elites affiliating themselves with religion, those who are turning against the other elites, this is a power play amongst elite groups, that power, religion, and the nation end up being equated in this new configuration. And they often even change laws to fit this new configuration. So while this may have marginally aided some of the general population belonging to the majority religious group, the political and social elites at the heads of these movements benefited much more so. And industrial and agricultural elites, the enemies of these movements early on, while momentarily taking a hit, soon ingratiated and allied themselves with the new regimes and benefited once again. So instead of economically based movements that were often happening in the 1950s through the 70s with the lower classes, the new configuration became economic class warfare, not from below against the elites, but in fact, economic warfare of elites against the rest of the population. But the masses are often made to comply because of this alignment along religious identity. And so then, what is to be done by those who now no longer have a way of fighting the elites because this similarity and alignment? What do they often do? They often turn against religious minorities and oppress them to extract what wealth and privilege they can from an even lower group. And so while I narrate this kind of modern history in very bleak terms and focused on economic and political issues, I really do see that the rise of religious violence very much coincides with these economic and political changes and the rise of kind of neoliberal economics and politics in the late 20th century.
Thank you so much, Professor Dean. You have put all your thoughts in a nutshell and you have shared with us. So thank you for that. And my next question is, what are the historical dynamic of hate speech and how it has been intensified in the modern era? What strategies do you suggest to address the problem of hate speech through social media? Like, it is a very important issue we should talk on.
Yeah, thank you. And hate speech is a particular, as you said, a certain difficult component of the larger instances of violence that we see happening. I also, when I tend to think about this too, I don't think of hate speech as the kind of crux of the problem. In as far as, hate speech does in and of itself do harm, it is more so the readiness and willingness of people to enact the violence on the basis of that hate speech that causes the real harm to come to pass. And so what we've seen from time and again in instances of often mass violence against minorities in South Asia is that hate speech often coincides with a fair amount of planning and organization, ensuring that violent groups will target particular individuals, particular properties, and also face no consequences because there has been coordination with certain allied police, military, and judicial officers. So when hate speech coincides then with such quote unquote successful operations, more individuals are encouraged to participate and benefit from joining this kind of winning team, whether they in fact have bought into the ideology of these groups or not. And at that point, hate speech then functions more like an advertisement, that they are kind of reiterating the lines of demarcation between who is the in-group and who is the out-group. as well as kind of publicly reminding people who is in charge of this alliance and how and when people should participate in forthcoming violence. So while addressing hate speech may help in some degree, especially, as you said, in social media, which then is a much more rapid and well-organized way to bring people together for these types of actions. What seems needed is more action to disrupt the kind of alliance of complicitude that, so that we don't see mass violence happening and police officers standing on the side and kind of doing nothing about it, or people being arrested and then being let off immediately by judges and so on and so forth. That is more of a signal to the populace that, oh, this behavior is almost endorsed by governments, and therefore you can participate in those things without fear of consequences.
Yes, you have given a new perspective to think over this issue, and thank you for these suggestions and the strategies you have shared. My next question is, as you know, as we all are observing that cruelties against minorities are increasing every passing day due to majoritarian hegemony, would the development of a South Asian level commission will help to stop this violence and ensure the peace in the region of South Asia?
Yeah, thank you. This is a good question. I mean, I think it very much, I'd have to know more about what this commission would kind of look like. I mean, we've seen a number of times when such proposals have come out, and then we see no cooperation across different national groups. So even the idea of creating a broader commission or organization across countries in South Asia it's an interesting proposal. But I hesitate to have a lot of confidence that it would come about. But I also am thinking that given how much this type of violence seems to be coordinated with those who are in power, that would such a commission draw from the same people who are in fact perpetuating these sorts of problems. So again, as I kind of answered in the last question, preventing the complicity of politicians, police, military, judicial officers in violence against minorities, to me, seems even more pertinent, and might perhaps necessitate the creation of some sort of empowered independent organization to conduct reviews of such government functionaries to ensure that they at least uphold the existing laws on the books that are meant to protect minorities from violence. And if they are found to not be upholding those laws, they face dismissal from their position. That if there were a group that can do that sort of review and have that sort of power that are not already part of those same networks, I feel like that would be able to do something to at least start with the laws that already exist, let alone many more that probably need to be put into place. But again, there is that fear that, oh, you just make one more organization and maybe it'll be filled with the same sorts of people already doing this sort of thing. And so I'm not sure. I'm often kind of, I'm better at identifying the issues, but creating those kind of practical results is practical solutions is very difficult.
Okay, thank you for your comment on this particular question. And my second last question is, tell us about your current projects, as you already shared, but are there any other project or research work you are currently working on? And also share the dynamics of society and human rights you are working currently.
Sure, thank you. So earlier this week, it was just announced that the Routledge Handbook of Critical Kashmir Studies will be released on August 5th of this year. And I have contributed a chapter to that volume with the title Religious and Political Power in Kashmir, Recollecting the Past for the Post-Colonial Present. And that chapter addresses the ways in which important Kashmiri religious figures from the past have been deployed by Pakistani and Indian politicians to assert their claims over Kashmir and further their political agendas. And in this chapter, I address how and why such reappropriations are attempted, as well as how Kashmiris might be able to reclaim their heritage, their figures, to further their own visions for Kashmir. But that's just one chapter amongst an incredible collection in this volume. So I hope everyone who is interested in such critical studies of Kashmir is able to obtain a copy of this book that's forthcoming in August.
Thank you for sharing this, and good luck for your projects and for your upcoming research work, and we are looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you.
So last but not the least, what message do you want to convey to our audience, and how one can contribute to ensure peace at a personal level or at a personal capacity?
Yeah, thank you. And this, it is important that even though, as I've talked about, are these larger social and political forces, that everyday efforts are important. And so I hope that everyone listening in some ways makes an effort going forward to take a moment whenever they read, hear, or view something that seems to place the blame for the difficulties they face in everyday life onto one particular group, and instead question why someone is making such an argument and who might be benefiting or suffering from such assertions. Furthermore, when you witness somebody being abused in public, I would encourage you, if you can, and sometimes that situation is too dangerous to do so, but if you can, intervene to try to stop the situation. So I should say that, sometimes collective public action, even physical action, might be called for in order to bring about a better world. But more often than not, when we see such abuse and violence happening to someone, that is enacted with those with relatively greater power against those with less, in order to perpetuate oppression and garner one's own privilege beyond the privilege that they even already have. And so intervening in such small daily situations is not only good in and of itself, but hopefully will lead one to working towards such justice at a greater level, that when you make this a habit in your day-to-day life, that then you are motivated to take these individual instances and try to bring about a way in which that you don't need to individually intercede, but we are able, as a kind of society as a whole, prevent such types of violent actions, so that these individual instances are, never enough. They should be done and can hopefully lead to greater change.
Yeah, that's very meaningful message, and hopefully we all will practice this and will make the world a better place, at least with our personal capacity. So at last, I want to thank you so much, Professor Dean, for enlightening us with your valuable comments and valuable researches and your knowledge. So I really thank you on the behalf of Team Sarim, and looking forward for our everlasting collaboration.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me, and it was great to speak with you today.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.